The strongest people are usually the ones nobody notices. Every evening at exactly 7:15, I left the hospital. Not 7:10. Not 7:20. Exactly 7:15. The nurses joked about it. The doctors noticed it. My supervisor stopped asking about it months ago. Everyone assumed I had a busy social life waiting for me somewhere beyond the hospital doors. The truth was far less exciting. My name is Olivia Carter. I was 28 years old, and every minute of my life belonged to someone else. The rehabilitation wing where I worked never seemed to slow down. Patients needed encouragement. Families needed reassurance. Paperwork multiplied faster than anyone could complete it. Most days I barely noticed the hours passing until I looked up and saw the clock approaching 7. Then everything inside me shifted. No matter what I was doing, I started preparing to leave. Not because I wanted to, because I had to. On that particular Thursday evening, rain tapped softly against the hospital windows. The city outside looked blurred beneath gray clouds and traffic lights. I was helping an elderly patient finish a walking exercise when one of the physicians approached me. "A few of us are grabbing dinner after work," he said. "You should come." I smiled politely. "Thank you, but I cannot." He laughed. "You always say that." He was right. I always did. Birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings, team dinners, networking events. I missed them all. Eventually people stopped inviting me. It was easier that way. Less explaining. Less guilt. At 7:14 I signed my final report. At 7:15, I was walking through the front entrance into the cool Manhattan evening. The rain had weakened to a light drizzle. I pulled my coat tighter and headed toward the subway station. Around me thousands of people rushed through the city. Some were heading home. Others were just beginning their nights. Mine was only half finished. 40 minutes later, I climbed the narrow stairs leading to a small apartment above a neighborhood grocery store. The building was old. The hallway lights flickered occasionally. The walls carried decades of wear. Yet the moment I unlocked the apartment door, everything else disappeared. "Olivia?" a voice called from the kitchen. I smiled immediately. "I am home." My younger brother Ethan appeared carrying a textbook under one arm. At 16 he was taller than he realized and somehow still looked younger than he was. His dark hair was messy. His expression carried the familiar combination of intelligence and teenage exhaustion. "How was school?" I asked. "Better than algebra." "That bad?" "Worse." I laughed and took off my coat. Dinner simmered on the stove. Laundry waited in a basket near the couch. Homework covered half the kitchen table. The apartment was small, crowded, and imperfect. It was also the center of my entire world. After our parents passed away 3 years earlier, everything changed overnight. One day I was simply a sister. The next I became something closer to a parent. There had been no training, no warning, just responsibility, bills, decisions, sacrifices. Every choice I made carried Ethan's future with it. Later that evening, while Ethan studied for a chemistry exam, I sat at the kitchen table reviewing expenses. Rent, utilities, school costs, grocery receipts. Numbers filled the page. Some months felt easier than others. This was not one of them. Still, when I glanced across the room and saw Ethan focused on his books, I felt something stronger than worry. Purpose. What I did not know was that somewhere across the city, a powerful man had started noticing a pattern. Every evening at 7:15, Olivia Carter disappeared. And sooner or later, Dominic Romano intended to find out why. The people carrying the heaviest burdens are often the best at pretending everything is fine. The next few weeks followed the same pattern. Every morning, I arrived at the hospital before sunrise. Every evening, I left at exactly 7:15. The routine never changed. Patients came and went. New cases arrived. Old cases improved. Days blended together until the calendar itself seemed to move faster than I could follow. Most people believed I was disciplined. The truth was simpler. My life only worked because every minute had a purpose. One Thursday afternoon, the rehabilitation department hosted a small recognition event for staff members. Nothing formal. Just coffee, pastries, and speeches that lasted longer than anyone wanted. I stood near the back of the room holding a paper cup while coworkers laughed and exchanged stories. You should stay after, one nurse said. We are all going to dinner. I smiled. I cannot. She sighed dramatically. One day we are going to discover your secret life. If only she knew. At 7:15, I was already heading toward the subway station. Across Manhattan, Dominic Romano sat inside a private meeting surrounded by executives discussing projects worth millions of dollars. Most people focused entirely on the conversation. Dominic's attention drifted elsewhere. His assistant had recently mentioned something unusual. A hospital employee who never stayed late, never attended events, never socialized, always left at the exact same time. Under normal circumstances, the observation would have meant nothing. Yet something about Olivia Carter remained in his thoughts. He had seen her several times during charitable visits connected to the hospital. She was always helping someone, always moving, always focused on others. And somehow, despite everything around her, she never seemed interested in drawing attention to herself. That evening, as rain covered Manhattan once again, I stopped by a grocery store before heading home. I checked prices carefully. Fresh vegetables, milk, bread, eggs. Every dollar mattered. The cashier greeted me by name. That alone revealed how often I visited. By the time I climbed the stairs to the apartment, my arms were full of grocery bags. Ethan opened the door before I could reach for my keys. Let me help. He grabbed 2 bags immediately. You did not have to wait by the door. I heard your footsteps. I laughed softly. You always do. Inside, homework covered half the kitchen table again. A science project occupied the other half. Life was crowded, messy, and real. During dinner, Ethan talked about school, a history presentation, an upcoming basketball game, college preparation meetings beginning next semester. I listened carefully, asking questions and offering advice whenever I could. Sometimes I forgot he was 16. Other times I remembered all too clearly. Later that night, after he went to bed, I opened my laptop and reviewed household expenses. The numbers looked worse than I expected. Rent would increase next month. Ethan needed new athletic shoes. College application costs would arrive soon. I closed my eyes briefly. For a moment, exhaustion pressed heavily against my shoulders. Then I heard movement from the hallway. Ethan appeared wearing an oversized sweatshirt. You are still awake? He asked. I smiled immediately. So are you. He looked toward the computer screen and understood more than I wanted him to. Everything okay? The question broke my heart because he should not have needed to ask it. He should have been worrying about school, friends, and normal teenage problems, not household finances. I closed the laptop. Everything is fine. He studied me for a moment before nodding. Eventually he returned to bed. Alone at the kitchen table, I stared at the dark screen. Some promises become part of who you are. Years earlier, standing beside my parents' hospital beds, I promised myself Ethan would never feel abandoned. No matter how difficult life became, I would keep that promise. What I did not know was that somewhere else in the city, Dominic Romano was becoming increasingly determined to understand why Olivia Carter carried so much responsibility alone. Some secrets stay hidden not because people are trying to deceive you, but because they are trying to survive. March arrived with colder winds and longer days. At the hospital, life continued at its usual pace. Patients recovered. New admissions arrived. Schedules changed constantly. Yet beneath the routine, small details were beginning to attract attention. One afternoon, I was helping a patient practice walking exercises when my supervisor approached. You have not taken a vacation day in over a year. I looked up from my notes. I know. That is not healthy. I smiled politely. I will think about it. She laughed. That is exactly what you said 6 months ago. The conversation ended there, but the truth remained. Vacations cost money. Time away from work created problems. And most importantly, I never stopped thinking about Ethan. Every decision in my life eventually circled back to him. Across the city, Dominic Romano found himself asking more questions than usual. Not invasive questions. Not personal investigations. Simply observations. The woman he occasionally encountered through hospital charity programs never seemed to slow down. She worked long hours. She declined invitations. She rarely talked about herself. The more he noticed, the more unusual it became. One rainy evening, Dominic attended a fundraising meeting near the hospital. The event ended later than expected. As guests filtered into the night, he stepped outside and noticed a familiar figure across the street. Olivia Carter. She stood beneath a streetlight carrying a grocery bag in one hand and speaking on her phone. Her expression looked concerned but calm. Dominic had no intention of listening. He simply happened to hear a few words while passing nearby. "Did you finish your assignment?" she asked. A pause followed. Then she smiled softly. "Good. I will be home soon." Another pause. "Do not wait up." The warmth in her voice caught his attention. It was different from the professional tone she used at work. Different from the polite distance she showed everyone else. It sounded protective. Almost parental. By the time the call ended, she was already heading toward the subway. Dominic watched her disappear into the crowd before continuing on his own way. 2 nights later, another coincidence occurred. I stopped at a small pharmacy after work to pick up allergy medication for Ethan. Spring was approaching, and his seasonal allergies always arrived early. The pharmacist greeted me by name and handed me the prescription. "How is your brother doing?" she asked. "Much better," I replied. "Thank you for asking." The brief exchange seemed insignificant. To me it was. To the man standing a few feet away waiting for his own purchase, it was not. Dominic glanced up from the counter. "Brother." The word remained in his thoughts. Later that week, another piece of the puzzle appeared unexpectedly. Ethan's school hosted an academic recognition ceremony. I finished work early and rushed across town to attend. The event was held inside a modest auditorium filled with students, parents, and teachers. Ethan received recognition for academic achievement and community service. Watching him walk across the stage filled me with pride. For a few minutes, every sacrifice felt worthwhile. As the ceremony ended, families gathered in the lobby. Students took photographs. Parents celebrated. While helping Ethan straighten his tie, I heard a familiar voice nearby. "Congratulations." I turned and saw Dominic Romano standing a short distance away. Surprise flashed across my face. Ethan looked between us curiously. Dominic offered a small smile. Then his attention shifted briefly toward my brother. In that instant, everything finally made sense. The exact schedule, the constant urgency, the long hours, the sacrifices nobody talked about. Olivia Carter was not rushing home every night because she had somewhere more exciting to be. She was raising a 16-year-old boy alone. And for the first time, Dominic understood the true weight she had been carrying all along. The people who carry responsibilities for years often forget how heavy those responsibilities actually are. After the school ceremony, life returned to its familiar rhythm. At least on the surface. Ethan went back to classes. I returned to the rehabilitation wing. Bills continued arriving with impressive consistency. Nothing dramatic changed. Yet somehow everything felt slightly different. Perhaps it was because someone else finally knew the truth. Not the entire truth. Not every detail. But enough. A few days after the ceremony, I found myself leaving the hospital later than usual. A patient had needed extra assistance, and paperwork delayed me nearly 30 minutes. By the time I stepped outside, the evening sky had already darkened. My phone buzzed immediately. "Ethan." "Hey." I answered while walking toward the subway entrance. "Where are you?" "Still at the hospital." "You missed dinner." I smiled despite my exhaustion. "I know. I made sandwiches." "You made dinner?" "Do not sound so surprised." I laughed softly. "I am impressed. That makes one of us." The call ended a few minutes later, leaving me with the familiar mixture of pride and guilt. Ethan was growing up. Part of me celebrated that fact. Another part wished he did not have to grow up quite so fast. The following Saturday morning, our apartment looked like most family homes. Laundry waited to be folded. Grocery lists covered part of the refrigerator. Ethan sat at the kitchen table finishing an essay while I balanced a stack of household paperwork. Rent, utilities, insurance, school expenses. Every category seemed larger than the month before. "You know," Ethan said without looking up from his laptop, "normal people spend weekends having fun. Normal people do not have your handwriting." That is unrelated. I disagree. He rolled his eyes dramatically. I laughed. Moments like that kept everything together. Across Manhattan, Dominic Romano sat in a quiet office reviewing reports. Yet his thoughts repeatedly returned to the image of Olivia standing proudly beside her younger brother at the school ceremony. Something about the scene stayed with him. Not because it was unusual, because it was honest. Most people presented polished versions of themselves to the world. Olivia never seemed interested in appearances. She simply did what needed to be done. That realization affected him more than he expected. A week later, another coincidence brought us together. The hospital hosted a community wellness event sponsored by several local organizations. Volunteers moved between information booths. Families attended educational sessions. Children participated in health activities. I spent most of the day helping visitors navigate the event. Around noon, while organizing materials near the entrance, I noticed a familiar figure approaching.
Dominic Romano.
He greeted several organizers before stopping near my table. Busy day, he asked. Very. You seem happy about it. I am. His smile appeared briefly. Most people complain when they are overwhelmed. Most people are probably smarter than me. That earned a genuine laugh. For the next few minutes we talked about the event, community programs, and education. Nothing extraordinary. Yet the conversation felt unusually easy. Then his attention shifted toward a photograph displayed on my table. Showed Ethan holding an academic award. Your brother, he asked. I nodded. Pride immediately softened my expression. He works harder than anyone I know. Dominic studied the picture for a moment. Then he looked back at me. I think he learned that from someone. For a second I did not know how to respond. The compliment landed differently than most. Felt sincere. Not polite. Not automatic. Sincere. Later that evening, while walking home through the fading sunlight, I found myself thinking about the conversation. Meanwhile, Dominic stood near the hospital entrance watching volunteers clean up after the event. The more he learned about Olivia Carter, the more one fact became impossible to ignore. She had spent years putting someone else's future ahead of her own. And for the first time in a very long time, he found himself deeply respecting a person not because of what they possessed, but because of what they quietly sacrificed every single day. Respect grows differently than attraction. It arrives quietly, settles deeply, and changes everything before you realize it. By early April, life had become slightly more manageable. Not easier, just more predictable. The hospital remained busy. Ethan remained determined to excel in school. Bills continued arriving with remarkable punctuality. Yet for the first time in a while, I felt as though I was keeping pace with everything instead of constantly falling behind. One Friday afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call during my lunch break. Hello, is this Olivia Carter? A voice asked. Yes. We are calling from the Academic Enrichment Program at Columbia Preparatory Foundation. I frowned slightly. I think you may have the wrong person. Actually, we are calling about Ethan Carter. My attention sharpened immediately. The representative explained that Ethan had been selected for a summer leadership and academic development program. The opportunity included workshops, mentorship sessions, and college preparation resources. It sounded impressive. Almost too impressive. There must be some mistake, I said. Applications closed months ago. A special review committee recently reopened several positions. The explanation felt unusual, but I did not question it further. When the call ended, I sat quietly for several seconds. Then I smiled. Ethan would be thrilled. That evening he was. The moment I shared the news, his eyes widened. Seriously? Seriously? You are joking. I am not. He looked stunned, then excited, then overwhelmed. Within seconds he was already researching the program online. Watching his reaction reminded me why every sacrifice mattered. Across Manhattan, Dominic Romano received a brief update from an associate. Nothing detailed. Nothing that would connect him publicly to the opportunity. Exactly as he preferred. He listened quietly before ending the conversation. Helping from a distance felt right. Olivia valued independence too much to accept charity. But opportunities were different. Opportunities allowed people to succeed on their own. Several days later, another small surprise appeared. Ethan's basketball coach informed him that a community equipment grant had covered expenses for students who needed additional support. Uniform costs, training materials.
Participation fee.
Ethan mentioned it casually during dinner. That is good news, I said. A lot of families were worried. He nodded. Coach said somebody donated anonymously.
Courtesy.
The word appeared more frequently than usual lately. Still, I thought little of it. The city was full of generous people. Sometimes good things simply happened. One Saturday morning, I met Dominic at a neighborhood coffee shop after accidentally running into him outside a bookstore. The meeting was unplanned, at least as far as I knew. Sunlight filled the cafe through tall windows. The atmosphere felt relaxed and welcoming. We talked for nearly an hour. Work, education, New York, life. Eventually the conversation shifted toward family. Your brother seems impressive, Dominic said. Pride immediately softened my expression. He is. You talk about him the way parents talk about their children. I laughed quietly. Some days it feels that way. The humor faded slightly as I continued. After our parents died, there was never really another option. Dominic listened carefully. That must have been difficult. I stared into my coffee. It was. For a moment memories returned. Hospital rooms, legal paperwork, sleepless nights, fear, responsibility. But Ethan deserved stability, I said. So I did what needed to be done. Dominic remained silent for several seconds. Then he asked a question nobody had ever asked before. And who did that for you? I looked up. The answer never came. Because there was no answer. For years, every conversation had focused on Ethan. His future. His needs. His opportunities. Nobody had stopped to wonder who carried the weight behind the scenes. Dominic noticed my silence. He did not press further. Yet something changed in that moment. Not dramatically. Not visibly. But for the first time I felt seen. And for the first time, Dominic Romano understood that Olivia Carter's greatest strength was also the thing that left her carrying every burden alone. Some realizations arrive so quietly that you only recognize them long after they have already changed you. After that coffee shop conversation, I could not stop thinking about Dominic Romano's question. Not because it was complicated, but because it was simple in a way I had never allowed myself to consider. Who did that for you? The answer should have been my parents. Once upon a time it was. After they were gone, life became divided into before and after. After meant responsibility. After meant survival. After meant Ethan. Days continued as they always had. Hospital shifts. Subway rides. Grocery lists. Homework checks. Yet something subtle began to shift in the background. Ethan noticed it first. You seem different lately, he said one evening while washing dishes beside me. Different how? Less stressed. I laughed softly. That is impossible. He tilted his head. Maybe not less stressed. Just less alone. The words stayed with me longer than I expected. Across the city, Dominic Romano reviewed a report detailing community education programs connected to the recent opportunities Ethan had received. Nothing in the documents explicitly linked back to him. That was intentional. Yet the pattern remained clear to him. Every improvement, every unexpected opening, every small relief that had entered their lives recently traced back to systems quietly influenced by people who never needed recognition. He closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. Most people in his position measured success through visible outcomes, expansion, profit, influence. But what he had begun doing felt different. He was measuring impact through absence. Absence of stress. Absence of fear. Absence of barriers that should not have existed in the first place. Meanwhile, Olivia continued her routine unaware of how many invisible threads were slowly shifting around her life. One evening after finishing a late shift, I stopped by the grocery store as usual. The cashier greeted me warmly. You are working late again, she said. I smiled politely. That is how it goes sometimes. When I reached the apartment, Ethan was already studying at the kitchen table. Papers were spread across every available surface. You missed dinner, he said without looking up. I had something at the hospital. You always say that. I paused. Because it is usually true. He finally looked at me. You should eat better. I laughed. Since when did you become my nutritionist? He shrugged. Since you stopped having time to take care of yourself. I opened my mouth to respond, then stopped. There was no argument to make. He was right. Later that night, after Ethan went to bed, I sat alone reviewing bills again. The numbers had not improved. They never did on their own. I pressed my fingers against my temples, trying to focus. The exhaustion was not new. It was simply more noticeable when everything else was quiet. Somewhere between those thoughts, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. I almost ignored it. Then I opened it. It was brief. You do more than anyone realizes. Do not forget that. No signature. No explanation. Just a single line. For a long moment I stared at the screen. Then I set the phone down slowly. The message felt familiar in a way I could not explain. Not because I had received something like it before, but because it echoed something I had never heard said aloud. That night I did not sleep immediately. Instead, I sat by the window watching the city. Lights flicker in the distance. For years, I believed invisibility was part of responsibility, that doing everything alone was simply what strong people did. I did not yet realize that someone else had started challenging that belief from the shadows of my life. And I still did not understand how deeply that quiet presence would eventually change everything I thought I knew about being alone. The hardest truths are often the ones you only understand after someone else quietly shows them to you. After the anonymous message, life did not suddenly change. It never does in ways you can immediately recognize. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I had to, but because I could not stop thinking. Ethan was already preparing for school when I entered the kitchen. You are up early, he said. Could not sleep much, I replied honestly. He studied me for a moment but did not press further. That was one of the things I appreciated about him. He knew when silence was safer than questions. The hospital shift that day felt unusually long. Not because of workload, but because my thoughts kept drifting back to the message. You do more than anyone realizes. I tried to ignore it, but it kept resurfacing in quiet moments between patients and paperwork. Across Manhattan, Dominic Romano stood in a private meeting reviewing updated reports. His assistant placed a tablet in front of him showing activity summaries related to community support initiatives connected indirectly to Olivia and Ethan's circumstances. Nothing directly linked to him was visible. That was intentional. Yet Dominic was not focused on recognition. He was focused on patterns. The pattern was becoming clearer. Every time Olivia faced pressure, something shifted in her environment. Small supports appeared. Opportunities emerged. Financial strain eased slightly, just enough to prevent collapse. Someone was ensuring she did not fall. But she was never told. That was what struck him the most. She was still carrying everything as if she was alone. Later that week, I received another unexpected moment of relief. The hospital administration announced a minor schedule adjustment. My hours were slightly reduced due to staffing changes. It was not significant on paper, but for me it meant an extra hour at home each evening. When I told Ethan, he looked pleased. That is good, he said. Maybe you can actually sit down for dinner now. I smiled. I sit down for dinner. He raised an eyebrow. Sometimes. I laughed, unable to argue. That night, for the first time in a long while, we actually ate together without rushing. It was simple. Nothing special. But it felt different. Not easier. Just less heavy. Meanwhile, Dominic found himself observing Olivia more deliberately than before. Not in a way that interfered with her life. He never approached her directly beyond necessary encounters. Instead, he studied the rhythm of her days from a distance through circumstances he happened to encounter. He saw her leaving the hospital at the same time. He saw her carrying groceries late at night. He saw her walking quickly through rain without complaint. And each time he noticed the same thing. She never slowed down. Not because she wanted to prove anything, but because stopping was not an option she had ever been given. One evening, Dominic attended a private charity gathering where hospital administrators discussed future funding plans. Olivia was not present. She never attended events like this. While listening to conversations around him, he quietly asked a question about rehabilitation staff retention. The administrator hesitated before answering. "There is one employee who never takes time off," she said. "Olivia Carter. Extremely reliable. Always prioritizes patients and family obligations." Family obligations. The phrase lingered in Dominic's mind longer than anything else said that night. Later, as he returned to his vehicle, he paused briefly before getting inside. Through the hospital's glass entrance, he saw Olivia walking out alone in her familiar routine. Coat slightly worn, posture steady, expression focused. She looked like someone who had accepted solitude as normal life. And for the first time, Dominic understood that the most dangerous burden is not what people see. It is what they assume you can carry forever. What he did not yet realize was that his quiet involvement had already begun changing the structure of her life in ways she had not noticed. And eventually, silence would no longer be enough to protect either of them from the truth. There are moments in life when you realize someone has been standing beside your story long before you ever noticed them. The next phase of life did not announce itself. It unfolded quietly, almost invisibly. Days continued in their familiar rhythm. I worked. Ethan studied. The city moved. Yet beneath that surface, something subtle had changed. I began noticing small differences I could not explain. A hospital form processed faster than expected. A delayed reimbursement suddenly approved. A community request accepted without resistance. None of it was dramatic. None of it came with explanation. But all of it felt connected in a way I could not fully understand. I tried not to think about it too much. Life had taught me that questions without answers were often just distractions. Still, the thought of the anonymous message returned more often than I expected. "You do more than anyone realizes." One evening after finishing a long shift, I stopped by the grocery store with Ethan. He was unusually quiet while helping me carry bags. "Everything okay?" I asked. He nodded. "Just thinking about school stuff." I smiled. "That sounds serious." He shrugged. "Not really. Just college applications." I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. "We will figure it out," I said. He looked at me briefly. "I know we will." That simple confidence in his voice stayed with me longer than the conversation itself. Across the city, Dominic Romano sat alone in a private office reviewing updated summaries of ongoing educational and community support programs. The data showed consistent improvements in multiple areas connected to Ethan's academic opportunities and Olivia's professional workload balance. Everything remained carefully structured to avoid visibility. No direct trace pointed back to him in public records. That was intentional. Yet Dominic was no longer interested in hiding the existence of change. He was interested in ensuring it remained stable. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. His assistant entered holding a folder. "There is a staffing report from the hospital," she said. Dominic nodded for her to continue. "They are planning to reduce overtime strain on rehabilitation staff. Olivia Carter will benefit from adjusted scheduling." He paused briefly. "Good." The assistant hesitated. "Do you want confirmation that the adjustments remain anonymous?" Dominic looked out the window for a moment before answering. "Yes." That single word carried finality. Later that week, I found myself unexpectedly called into a brief meeting with hospital administration. They informed me that a new support initiative had been implemented for rehabilitation staff. Reduced hours, better scheduling flexibility, improved patient load distribution. It sounded like something that should have required months of planning, yet it had already been approved. When I asked about the origin of the initiative, the administrator simply smiled. External partners interested in healthcare sustainability. I accepted the explanation without further question. That evening, I left the hospital earlier than usual. The city outside felt different in a way I could not name. Ethan was waiting at home, studying at the kitchen table. "You are home early," he said with mild surprise. "Changes at work," I replied. He nodded. "Good changes." I hesitated, then smiled. "I think so." We ate dinner together again. It had become a small ritual I valued more than I admitted. Afterward, Ethan returned to his room to study while I washed dishes. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of running water. For the first time in a long while, I noticed something unusual. The weight I had carried for years felt slightly lighter. Not gone. Just shifted. Across the city that same night, Dominic stood near the window of his office again. The skyline of Manhattan stretched endlessly before him. He thought about Olivia Carter, about Ethan, and about everything they had endured without asking for help. He had once believed that strength was measured by how much a person could accomplish alone. But watching her life from a distance had changed that belief. Strength, he realized, was not about isolation. It was about persistence despite it. And for the first time, Dominic understood that stepping into someone's life did not always mean revealing yourself. Sometimes it meant quietly ensuring they were never forced to stand alone again. What neither of them realized yet was that silence was no longer enough to keep their worlds separate. Not anymore. The truth does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives through accumulation, through patterns too consistent to ignore, through quiet decisions made by someone you have never properly seen. By early summer, life had stabilized in ways I could finally feel but not fully explain. Ethan had been accepted into a new academic program that gave him access to advanced courses and mentorship opportunities. His confidence had grown in small but noticeable ways. He spoke more freely about his future. He smiled more often. He stopped asking whether things would be okay because, for the first time in years, he seemed to believe they would be. I did not question the change too deeply. I simply accepted it with cautious gratitude. At the hospital, my schedule remained improved. The reduced overtime made it easier to breathe between shifts. Colleagues noticed I looked less exhausted. I told them I was simply adjusting. That was easier than trying to explain what I did not understand myself. Across Manhattan, Dominic Romano stood at the center of decisions that shaped entire systems without ever appearing in them directly. Reports confirmed continued stability in educational and healthcare support programs tied indirectly to Olivia Carter's environment. Everything was functioning as intended, quietly, precisely, without disruption. Yet for Dominic, the real shift was not in data. It was in understanding. He had begun to see Olivia not as someone struggling against life, but as someone carrying it for others without ever asking to share the weight. That realization changed how he approached every decision that followed. One evening, I arrived home later than usual after a difficult shift. Ethan was already waiting at the kitchen table, but instead of studying, he was staring at his phone. "You look serious," I said, while setting down my bag. "I got something today," he replied. I immediately became alert. "What kind of something?" He turned the screen toward me. It was an official acceptance letter. A prestigious summer program. Full academic support. Leadership development. College preparation guidance. My breath paused for a moment as I read it. "Ethan," I said softly, "this is incredible." He smiled, but there was confusion behind it. "I do not even know how I got selected. I thought I was just on a waiting list." I looked at the letter again. The acceptance process described was highly selective. Too selective for coincidence. Still, I forced a smile. "You earned it," I said. That night, after Ethan went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table longer than usual. The apartment was quiet. The city outside never stopped moving, but inside everything felt still. I thought about the anonymous message. I thought about the hospital changes. I thought about the program Ethan had just entered. Patterns. Not isolated events. Connected ones. The next afternoon, I visited the hospital cafeteria during a short break. A colleague sat down beside me and began talking about recent improvements in staff support systems. "It is strange," she said. "Everything started changing so suddenly a few months ago. Like someone decided to fix things overnight." I nodded politely. "Maybe we were just overdue for improvement." She laughed. "Maybe. Or maybe someone important is paying attention." That phrase stayed with me longer than I expected. Someone important is paying attention. Later that week, I met Dominic briefly outside the hospital entrance after finishing my shift. The air was warm, carrying the quiet hum of summer traffic. He stood near the steps as if he had been waiting, though I did not think too much of it at the time. "You look less tired," he said. I hesitated. "I feel less tired." He nodded as if that answer mattered more than I realized. "Good." We stood in silence for a moment before I spoke again. Ethan was accepted into a program. His expression remained calm, but something subtle shifted in his eyes. That is good news. It is more than good, I said. It does not make sense. He studied me quietly. Sometimes things do not need to make sense to be right. I looked at him carefully. Did you have anything to do with it? The question hung between us. Not accusatory. Not emotional. Just direct. Dominic did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. I would not interfere with something your brother did not deserve. It was not a denial. It was something more careful. Something deliberate. I did not press further. Instead, I simply nodded. Thank you, I said, though I was not sure for what exactly. As I walked away that evening, I did not yet have all the answers. But I no longer believed in coincidence the same way I once did. And somewhere behind me, Dominic Romano watched quietly, understanding that the moment of truth could no longer be delayed. Because some connections are not revealed all at once. They are revealed when silence finally becomes impossible to maintain.